Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Garlinsky, and this is Where You Want to Be, the show where I take you with me around the world to help you find your place within it. I've been lucky enough to study at university and spend a lot of my life both traveling and studying history, so I aim to use this whole series to have you come with me to all the places I've been and plan to go, learn a little about the history, learn a lot about the history, and learn a whole lot about the place itself. So, I'm very glad you guys are here, and I want to get into it. So today, we are going to do Stockholm, Sweden, the capital, and we're going to talk about some history. But first, I always like to do some quick facts, and I always open with the etymology of the city. So for Stockholm, there isn't an actual leading theory on where the etymology of this nation comes from. It's more so a legend, and I'm going to give you that legend. According to a 17th century myth, the people who made up the population of one of the first Viking settlements in the area, called Birka, decided to make a new settlement. To determine the location of this settlement, they tied gold to a log and drifted it into Lake Mälaren. Where it landed is present-day Rotherholm, which is where they decided to build the city. This is where Birger Jarl, one of the first major leaders of Stockholm, settled down, and the tower of it sits. It is currently the oldest building in Stockholm. And now that we've done the etymology of Stockholm, I wanted to get into some quick facts about the city before I actually expand into the history that we're going to cover. The first quick fact is that the subway system in Stockholm, which is known for being very expansive, is often called the longest art gallery in the world. This is because of the fact that the subway walls are lined with a long gallery of mosaics and art pieces, paintings and all that, from Europe and Sweden that represent the culture here, and this goes across the whole subway system in Stockholm, Sweden. So it's called one of the longest art galleries in the world, or known as the longest art gallery in the world, for the fact that it's just adorned with beautiful art up and down its halls. The next fact is that Stockholm is often referred to as the Venice of the North. That is because of its canals, ferries, art, and just general culture of being kind of a floating city, just like Venice, except instead of being in southern Europe and being in Italy, we are all the way up in the Nordics in Stockholm, Sweden. My final fact for you is that Stockholm actually doesn't have the presence of any factories or heavy metal industries or heavy industries in general. So the fact that there isn't manufacturing or just industry in general, it changes things about the society. And the main thing is that 85% of employment, or people that are employed in Stockholm, work in the service industry instead of any other major production industry like you'll see with other cities. So all of this makes Stockholm one of the cleanest cities in the entire world, both air-wise and just in general, because the culture is very clean and the work they do is very clean as well. And with that, that gets us at the end, where I do want to kind of flip to history. So I've given you guys the facts, some etymology, and this is not the end of the video, this is the end of the intro. So we're going to get on into this and do the history of Stockholm. So hope you guys enjoy. Our origins begin when northern Germanic tribes climb up into the Scandinavian peninsula and start to settle there. As these people started to interact with each other, they eventually formed different cultures and exchanged linguistics, eventually forming the Swedish language. The first real settlements and cities that were built here would be in the 700s CE, and they would lead to what we know as Stockholm. The first was Birka in the 700s, and then Sigtuna in the same century. Both of these were very significant, but it was actually Sigtuna that was the most important city in Sweden from around 1000 to 1200 CE. Now it's in the 1200s that Stockholm was actually established. This is when the Birger Jarl, who is one of the royals of Sweden and one of the first people to really recognize as a royal of Sweden, established a settlement here and began to move into ruling it. He was a royal from the House of Bjälbo, which ruled parts of Sweden for a significant time, and this led to big changes in what Sweden would be. So it took Sweden a long time to actually become this proper capital city. It took a lot of trade, it took a lot of development. This was through the Viking era, through different parts of history, and it wasn't until real Christian acceptance came here that the greater development of Stockholm came. This allowed them to interact heavily with other major organizations globally and across the European continent that helped them develop, mainly the Hanseatic League. Because of the fact that Stockholm became Christian, it no longer was a target for the Hanseatic League, it became a trade partner. The Hanseatic League was a kind of alliance of northern Germanic knights that both went on crusades and missions like that to convert people by the sword, but were also a Germanic trade union that traded throughout the North and Baltic Sea. Stockholm interacted with this group very often and did make a lot of money trading with them, did have a lot of interaction, as I said, but they never wanted to be a part of them. They never wanted to join the Hanseatic League, and that leads us to our next big historical thing, which is the Kalmar Union. In 1397, Sweden joins and forms the Kalmar Union. This was a union between the three great powers of the Nordics, which was Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. This was to unite all of them under one crown, under one monarch. That monarch would be Eric of Pomerania, who was coronated in Sweden at a town called Kalmar in 1397. Now, despite this kind of being a union to battle against the Hanseatic League for control of trade in the north, both the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and just Northern Europe in general, this didn't mean that Sweden was totally subordinate. It wasn't that Sweden fell very easily into this, and Stockholm was one of the biggest sections for that. Swedish politics were very different than Danish and Norwegian politics, so there was a lot of battles between them for control. The main battles were between Sweden and Denmark over controlling Stockholm itself. Stockholm was besieged and invaded many times between 1471 and 1520, and in that time, control of the city passed frequently between Denmark and Sweden. Now, the culmination of this was in an event known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. This is when King Christian II of Denmark decided to actually order an attack. This attack was a direct homicide of sorts on nobles and royal members of the Swedish court in Stockholm. This led to many people having their lives cut short because of Christian II, and for a time led Stockholm to being very vulnerable. That is why in 1520, Gustav Vasa is actually able to take over control of the city and completely change the rule that was going on here in Sweden at the time. The reign of Gustav Vasa was interesting. It was one that saw the Swedish monarch take a step up and really get his hands into a lot of different pots that controlled Stockholm. A big thing that happened in Stockholm and a lot of greater Sweden because of Gustav Vasa was the spread of Protestantism. He paid many clergymen to spread the word of Protestantism around the area and to different parts of Stockholm and beyond. And this led to the eventual change from scripture being read in Latin to Swedish, and then eventually Latin being banned overall. So this is what kind of pushed Sweden to be one of the nations that was more on the Protestant side of the eventual 30 Years' War and just a general split in Europe. And it changes the development of the nation, it changes the alliances it has, and it changes where Sweden stood in general in the European standings. Now, this is followed up by the spread of the Swedish Empire, mainly done by a man named Gustav Adolphus II. He was definitely the greatest military leader of the Middle Ages for Sweden, and he expanded Sweden's influence very far into different directions, even managing to defeat their great rival like Denmark in a few different battles before running into brick walls with other hard generals that we'll mention later. Eventually, things started to become challenging for Sweden when that leader died. Gustav Adolphus dies after the 30 Years' War, where again, there kind of was this big split. The 30 Years' War is practically a Protestant versus Catholic war that happened in Europe to kind of reshape the map and change what rights were available to people across the continent. Now, there are much deeper things that affected this war, such as trade and previous alliances and things that went much beyond religion, but the root of it is considered to be in a religious battle. But this affected so much of Europe that it became a much bigger thing, literally lasting 30 years, that affected so many people, affected the economy of all these nations, and affected the way Europe was structured. The end of this war literally had Europe directly reshaped to make up for what happened. Prior to this, Stockholm was the most important city in the Swedish Empire. It collected all the trade. It grew rapidly compared to the earlier history we were just talking about. It was where not only the city could be well defended because they called it a fortress, but it was also where the monarch spent a lot of his time. All of this to say, things did change after the 30 Years' War, where Stockholm was reeling after Adolphus died. Once they lost this leader, things went south. It was really hard for them to understand what to do next. They lost their trade prominence, they lost their military prowess. All those things affected Sweden, and specifically Stockholm, negatively, but they had to adjust to this to move forward. And on top of all these things I just said, in 1625 there was a major fire in Stockholm that pushed the need for things to change. These needs for change were highlighted after the 30 Years' War, and Stockholm was in struggle. All of this culminated in the Swedish government getting very directly involved in developing Stockholm. Stockholm was beautified by the government, funds were collected, and it was a huge project. There was a merchant area built, there was cultural things like historical areas protected. All of this happened in Stockholm because of the Swedish government and because of the fact that the Swedes wanted it so bad. Stockholm was able to pull itself out of its troubles with the help of the Swedish government by really reestablishing itself as a trade monarch, a really leader of trade in the area. So there was laws passed, one known as a coercion, that actually helped Sweden get a kind of monopoly on trade across the archipelago that it touched. And Stockholm was the heart of this. Of course, I meant to say Stockholm if I didn't say that. But Stockholm absolutely dominated this and was one of the backbones to the economy changing. Eventually, they went really far uphill after being downhill after the 30 Years' War. Stockholm became a major trade city once again, and the economy flipped, now being one that was growing rapidly rather than declining rapidly. But despite the growth that happened here, the 1700s were still very hard for Stockholm and Greater Sweden. Sweden lost a lot of its influence as it started to lose not only control of its empire, part of that empire being Finland, it also lost its influence. It was still a strong trade area, with Stockholm being the heart of it, but Sweden in general lost the control it had on it, and the power of the Swedish Empire did falter. Because of this, Stockholm started to falter. The capital wasn't the main focus of the Swedish government anymore. It was the areas around it where farmers could be, where things like factories could be built, and all of that. So the focus went into that as the world began to start its process towards industrialization and changing things specifically for Stockholm because of the fact that the city had struggled and Sweden was struggling in general. More and more people started to live and develop areas outside of Stockholm rather than the capital itself. But despite this, Stockholm did bounce back. It was able to reclaim itself as the most important city in Sweden by really upping its different industries. The services it provided, the tourism it provided, and its big grandeur entrances and show and just overall power as a city helped invite people into Sweden through Stockholm. It became the entrance and kind of the gateway to understanding Sweden, and it ran with that. As well as this, other developments were made. Sewage, gasworks, greater running water, all of that was introduced in the 1800s, so that by the end of the century, the city had bounced back from its issues. It had bounced back from a tough time of struggling in war and struggling financially to being one that was once again very important and now seen as the city to see in Sweden. The 1900s were unique for Sweden. Compared to pretty much the entire rest of Europe, they had it special. They were able to maintain neutrality throughout the entirety of the war and really skillfully maneuvered both their interests with the Allies and the Axis powers to avoid any serious conflict. Because of this, the city continued to grow. There was development citywide, things were modernized, beautified, and all of that, and they pretty much played both sides. They did the same thing that America did with the Lend-Lease kind of act, where kind of played both sides before they got involved, but in this case, they never actually got involved. There was trade to the Axis powers, there was trade to the Allied powers, and kind of anything in between. Sweden maintained its neutrality very well, but it took a lot of maneuvering to get here. And of course, it faces criticism for this because of the evil that the Axis powers, and specifically Germany, was doing in Europe. There is a lot of criticism to be thrown at Sweden for the fact that it remained so neutral. And yes, it had a policy of neutrality, but there's something to be said for the bystander not saying anything when something really, really bad is happening. But nonetheless, Stockholm itself was very much a city that developed. The city was beautified, as I said. The city continued to grow, new districts were emerging, and many of them are now significant, thriving communities of today that wouldn't have happened or been built in that way had it not been for the way Sweden as a greater country was carrying itself at the time. And that brings us to 1991, where Stockholm was host to 30 world leaders in the Stockholm Initiative, the first of many Swedish-led meetings that were specifically targeting nuclear disarmament. Of course, Sweden remained very neutral throughout the Cold War, just didn't let itself fall behind the Iron Curtain. But because of this, they were at a place to negotiate. Sweden, of course, has been neutral and was neutral throughout that whole process of World War II and a lot of anything during World War I. On top of this, they were one that was able to develop rapidly and become a big name for energy and all sorts of things like that. So anything about nuclear weapons was something they wanted to target and specifically take down because they wanted to maintain safety for them, not only themselves, but for the world in general. And that's going to bring us to the present, where at this point, Stockholm is considered one of the best cities in Northern Europe for its education, its arts, and its overall cultural significance throughout the history it has had, which is a long history stretching over right around 1,000 years. It is very important to the Swedish royal family. It's important to the Swedish government. It's many, many things as a capital city, and just as a city in general, it's represented so much for Swedish culture and all of that, which I will talk about as I start to go through the travel tips and all sorts of things like that. So with that being said, Stockholm is a very well-developed city. It's made great jumps the last 100 years, 200 years from ups and downs, from major wars to all the things it avoided and was a part of. Stockholm is a very well-developed city known for its education and known for it being very centered in its Swedish roots, while still having a big acceptance to people coming to the city from around the world to either live or visit. But that is going to be the end of the history I give you guys here. Now, if you are interested in learning more history, I've covered both the greater history of Stockholm, Sweden, and of Sweden itself as a country on the podcast Young History. I'll link both of those down below, and if you want to check them out, please do. But I do encourage you, just in general, to dive deeper into any history you're hearing here, because there's so much interesting stuff to hear about Stockholm and the country Sweden itself. Now that we've gotten through some of the brief history of Stockholm, we're now going to do the history of some of the historical sites. The most famous one to start with is the Royal Palace. It is the official residence of the Swedish monarchy and one of Europe's largest palaces. Its history dates back to the 1200s, when a fortress, Tre Krasnor, was built on the site. After a devastating fire in 1697 destroyed the other structure, the current Baroque-style palace was designed by architect Nicodemus Tessin the Younger, and completed in the mid-1700s to become the beautiful palace in the Baroque style it is today. Over the centuries, the palace has served as a center for royal ceremonies, administrations, and cultural heritage. It houses important collections and showcases Swedish architecture and the grandeur of the royal family. The next we have is the German Church. Located in Gamla Stan, or Old Town, it has roots in the 1500s when the German-speaking community in the city established a place of worship. Originally part of a guild hall, the church was expanded and rebuilt in the late 16th and early 17th century to get to its current form. Its Gothic-style spire, completed in 1878, became the defining feature of Stockholm's skyline. The church has long served as a cultural and religious center for the city's German-speaking population and continues to stand as a historical place that represents the Germans that have lived here and the diverse heritage of the city of Stockholm. Next, we have the Nobel Prize Museum. The Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm created an experience for people to understand the legacy of Alfred Nobel and the achievements of Nobel Prize winners. It opened in 2001, and the museum is located in the historic building of the former Stockholm Stock Exchange in Gamla Stan. This museum contains many exhibits to actually show the discoveries of scientific winners or laureates in the Nobel Prize categories. There's also historical pieces that show people who made major history, politicians and their taglines, things like that. It is a major hub for people to be inspired by these winners and is one of the different things to experience in Stockholm when Old Town is stuff not connected to a more modern part of history, which is the Nobel Peace Prize. Finally, there is the Vasa Museum. The Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden showcases the Vasa, which is a 1600s warship that sank on its maiden voyage, which is its first voyage ever. This happened in 1628. It was salvaged from a seabed in 1961, and over 300 years it sat in the water, taking on the weight of the water and being eroded by it. The ship is remarkably well preserved, and now there's a museum for it. This museum opened in 1990 and was purpose-built to display the Vasa and its artifacts, offering visitors insight into Sweden's maritime history and naval engineering, as well as a look into life in the 1600s, as well as the kind of people that would be on the ship and why they would be on a ship like this. It has become one of Stockholm's most popular attractions, and it is one I do recommend. And with that, we're going to get into some travel tips. And as always, I have one that is consistent across most of my videos. That is book early, specifically with Stockholm, especially if you're doing any Royal Palace tours or the Vasa Museum tour. You can save yourself so much time. When I went to the Vasa, there was a full line around the entire building when I went, and it was something I was able to walk right past because of the fact that I booked early, and I didn't do anything special. I just booked it on the website or booked it on Viator. Both are relatively affordable, and you're going to get in way faster. My next recommendation for Stockholm is to use public transport and the public transport app. Stockholm is an incredibly well-connected city, especially in the touristy areas. It is really easy to navigate from the main train that you will get in at the main airport or the main train station, as I did, and to go to the Old Town and pretty much anywhere in the city. Stockholm also benefits from being an archipelago, so some of the public transport options are water taxis and ferries. My tip is to download the public transport app called SL-Journey Planner and Tickets. You can book single or multiple tickets for relatively cheap and even get passes in advance. It's a very easy app to use, and it made the whole process of just getting from A to B, be it from Gamla Stan to the Gröna Lund area or to the greater part of downtown, very easy and very efficient. My next one is for the Stockholm Cultural Festival. Now, this is my biggest tip because it's a unique one. But the most fun thing I did in Stockholm outside of the festival, which I will get into, was Gröna Lund. Gröna Lund is Stockholm's iconic amusement park, founded in 1883 on the Djurgården Island. Initially, it was a small entertainment venue with carousels and a few live performances, but over decades has grown into a major attraction, offering thrilling rides, concerts, and a whole lot of activities for Swedes and those visiting the area. And it's definitely one that I find to be pretty awesome. But the most fun thing I did was the Stockholm Cultural Festival. This was a live music, plethora of food trucks, huge nightly concert event that was happening in Sweden to celebrate different Swedish artists and artists from across Europe and other parts of the world to celebrate the culture of modern Stockholm, which is so very mixed and different. I definitely say to just check out when it's happening this coming year because I have not been able to find out. And however, this is definitely my biggest recommendation. So if you could plan your Stockholm trip or whatever your Greater Europe trip is, pass through Stockholm when this is happening, because I was told by a family friend I grew up with who grew up with me in South Florida, but then moved back to Sweden because they are ethnically Swedish and moved back to the homeland because they wanted to escape America. And it was one of my friend's uncles that said, hey, this is actually going on in Stockholm. If you're going there, you should check it out. And it was the coolest thing I did in Stockholm and probably Sweden overall. So I definitely recommend it. And now that we've covered the short history as well as covering the overall tips and some different historical sites here in Stockholm, Sweden, that is going to be the end for me today. I'm very glad you guys got to come and listen to this. I'm very glad you guys came to check it out. Stockholm is an awesome city. I was lucky enough to go there while that festival was happening to really see some cultural stuff from Sweden and the way the young people gather and all that and the different foods. It was just incredible. But just in general, Stockholm is very cool. The art is very cool. The architecture is incredible. The history of the city on such a unique place, just like Venice. It's a very unique thing to be living on, kind of like a peninsula archipelago mixture. It's cool. So I really did enjoy being in Stockholm, and I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this. And again, if you want to learn more, I have a lot more content on both Stockholm and Sweden down below. So hope you guys do enjoy, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. So with that being said, for the last time, my name is Race Karlinski. That was Where You Want to Be, and that was Stockholm. You guys have a good one.